5-foot-long sandwiches were a foot long or not a foot long, what would you do? Yeah, you go order some sandwiches. You would then measure the sandwiches, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And then you would do some math on it to say, hey, do I have enough evidence to say that Subway is lying or telling the truth? Right?
Based on the average or the mean?
Well, the average is the mean, right?
Oh, I mean, the mean.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we care about the mean, right? So that's a hypothesis test. And as we go through it, we'll see that it's a one sample T or Z test. The difference between the T and the Z, as we'll get to when we walk through each one, the hypothesis test, depends on your sample size. So if we observe a single sandwich below 12 inches, does that mean Subway is necessarily lying?
No.
No, right? We would expect there to be a couple that are going to be less than the spec limit, so that's going to be okay. So what do we think? If the average is, so we have 8 sandwiches?
Yes.
Yeah.
Take 7.
7. Oh, there's an 8th sandwich hanging out there. Someone make it. So probably one of the 90 buys something order for. But if the average of our 7 sandwiches are less than 12 inches, can we go run to the judge and say, see, look, would you be happy going into court with just 7 sandwiches?
No.
But what if you get a really small value? What if you get the average to be like 8?
Oh,
Average length being 8. We take our 7 sandwiches, we find the mean to be 8. Would you be happy going into court then?
yes.
So this intuition is exactly what the hypothesis test says. It relates the average to the sample size. So if you have a bigger sample size, you're more confident in the results. You're more willing to go up to the judge and say, hey, I looked at 1,000 Subway sandwiches, and our mean was 11.2, 11.25 inches. Look, I looked at 1,000 of them. It's really unlikely that those 1,000 sandwiches were all strange. There has to be something systematic that makes them smaller than 12 inches. Okay? So we have sandwiches. So we talked a lot earlier on about the importance of having a measurement system, right? We talked about measurement systems analysis, gauge R&R, and you intuitively have a sense of the importance of standard operating procedures when they come to measuring stuff and doing any sort of numerical determination. Let's think about how complicated some of the measurements are in the core, particularly if you work on the fiber thickness, right? So we have sandwiches. Sandwiches are kind of football shape, right? They're kind of oblong. How are we going to measure the sandwiches? And do you think we should just have one person measure the sandwich, or should we have 2 people measure the sandwich, or what do you think?
Yeah, more than one.
Okay. So we might want to see the operator-operator variation, right? So you might want to have you measure your sandwich and have your neighbor measure your sandwich, right? And you don't want your neighbor groping your sandwich.
Oh, my neighbor touching it. No offense.
Oh, no.
Okay, and that's a very
Somebody touching my food and then I gotta
exactly.
eat it.
So if we were to take the tape measure and put it along the tape, along the sandwich, that would be an example of a direct measurement. You're physically measuring the actual item. But we also have this idea of indirect measurements. So we could do an indirect measurement where you were to mark the paper and then measure the paper. Right?
Right.
Would you be happy with your neighbor touching the paper that your sandwich was in?
He can do whatever he wants with that paper.
Okay. That seems kind of reasonable. So we would do an indirect measurement instead of a direct measurement. We can't do the direct measurement because we can contaminate it by the process of doing the measurement. But we can take a pencil, outline it, and then measure the outline. Seems kind of reasonable, right?
Mhm.
Okay, but what are we going to do about the spheroid aspect, the fact that it's kind of rounded?
Do it at the longest point.
Okay, the longest point, right? Okay. Unfurl your sandwiches. Unfurl.
Okay. You unroll.
Oh, and remember the number of your sandwich so I can just link it up to what's up there.
Okay. Okay, it's unrolled.
Okay. Trace. Well, mark off where you're going to measure.
So trace the sandwich?
Well, just you need the ends of the sandwich. And you need to mark it in such a fashion that you'll be able to measure it, and your neighbor will be able to measure your sandwich.
Okay. On the paper, yeah.
Well, I don't want you to write on your sandwich itself. That would be bad. Okay, has everyone sufficiently marked their sandwich?
Yes. We got 2 lines.
I'm still seeing people struggling with marking their sandwich. You might want to move the sandwich to make sure you can actually see the mark. Good. Okay, has everyone marked their sandwich?
You mark it on the piece of paper, put it diagonally on the piece of paper that it's on.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, well,
Put your sub down, I don't want to touch it.
everyone's so
Open
funny
this
about-
paper. And then turn
there's
your
so many
sub
inappropriate things.
diagonally,
Okay.
no, across the paper, like put your sub this way to that way.
Oh, okay.
Everyone has a mark on their paper.
Yeah, and then mark it so that you can use this paper and roll
Oh.
your sandwich up in there.
Okay.
Oh,
So, there's tape measures lurking about. Measure your sandwich.
Thank you.
okay.
Small one looks like a big one.
And just write it down somewhere. Don't shout it out, just write it down. I get to be the 5-year-old. You don't get to be the 5-year-old. That's my job.
Oh, snap. 11 and a half.
Oh. Uh-oh.
Wow.
Okay, has everyone measured their sandwich?
Hold on.
Guys are killing me.
Anybody need a tape measure?
Well, you're going to need it in a sec because you're. Well, you're measuring the mark. Well, they should be the same, right? But some people express concern about other people groping their sandwich.
No, don't take it personally.
I know.
It's a common.
Understand.
It's actually a great example for indirect measurements, and that's how we're going to do it anyway. But invariably, someone says something.
Some people just take the hand.
And then-
That's why they have to.
Okay, everyone has measured their sandwich?
Yes.
Or,
Yeah.
okay, now you need to find a friend to measure your sandwich.
Here you go, buddy.
Your hair, get in here.
You like mustard, huh?
Oh, yeah. You got 12.
I know.
Yeah,
I told you when I saw mine, it looked big. We should have switched sandwiches.
yeah.
You didn't have that mustard on it. It's with you.
Yeah, I love dill and mustard.
Okay. Don't.
Oh, you got pastrami?
Okay,
Mm, I haven't had that in a long time.
okay, who has sandwich one?
I do.
You have sandwich one. Okay, so what did you get for your length?
I got 11 and a half.
11.5? And what did you get for his sandwich?
11.5.
11.5. Okay, who has sandwich two? Sandwich two. Sandwich two, the one in the back?
No, that's mine. Sandwich.
That's sandwich.
It's Brian.
Oh,
Hey,
Brian's nice, right?
You're right. Brian's on night.
Brian's on nights, okay. So I ordered him a sandwich and that's no big deal. Okay, sandwich three. 11.5. And what did your friend get for your sandwich?
Oh, snap.
Okay, sandwich four.
11 and 8.
Ooh. And the second measurement for sandwich four. Okay.
How do you get such a disparity?
Sandwich five.
Maybe they
Exactly.
switched the paper.
Yeah.
Okay, second measurement for sandwich five. Sandwich six.
11.5.
Okay, sandwich seven. 12. Sandwich eight.
12.
Okay, 12 too. And Lynette's on nights. Okay. So
Number 2.
I forgot number two. Oh, sorry about that. 12.25. Ooh, we got one above. Second measurement. Did you copy?
No. You mentioned. Oh my God.
Okay. You can now munch on your sandwiches if you want. You don't have to, but you can munch. So based upon that, would you be happy going into court?
No.
Can you highlight them all and tell me the average?
I can show you the average. Yep, that's a good idea. Let me just show you the averages.
You can, but I'm not doing it. No. My breakfast is still on the table. I did not even get the time to eat breakfast. That's why I'm hungry. So, okay.
Okay.
I needed more. So that's the mean?
Yep, that's the mean. M1 is the mean of your own sandwich, and M2 is the mean of your buddy, your friend. Okay, so we got a mean of 11.7 and the mean of 11.8.
So our it is more than the original value.
I need more data, because 11.8, some
Who's
place
got
they,
sandwich number 4? I don't trust that one.
you,
Yeah,
don't
right.
you don't trust sandwich number 4.
No, because how can you be off by that much?
Me.
Did you bite it already?
Well, no. My thing was, my bottom piece of bread was shorter than the top piece of bread.
Ah, okay, interesting. So we have averages. So based upon this data, we can ask a couple of different reasonable questions. So is there a statistically significant difference between your measurement and your neighbor's measurement?
No.
If you round it, it becomes 12.
Except for that one that,
Well, there's a couple differences, right? So we've got the 11.5 and 11.75, that's different. The 11 and an eighth versus 11 and a half, that's different. Then we've got 11.5 and 11.75, that's different. And then the rest to a degree. But do we have enough evidence to say that yours is statistically different than your neighbor's measurement of your sandwich? Ooh, sandwich is really good, over.
Yeah.
Oh,
That's fine. We lunch at too early. It's just that's fine.
I just bring the food. You get to decide when to eat it. Okay, so we see that the average for both of them is less than 12 inches. So are you happy to go into court and say, hey, Subway, you buy?
no, because 11.8 might be considered 12.
Well, it depends, right? If they're sealing a quarter of an inch, that means, well, every what? Every 48 subs they're sold. So how do we go about answering this question, right? How can we go to a judge and say, hey, this data is sufficiently weird enough to say that you're lying when you give me a 12-inch sandwich?
You're gonna see that the 95, 97% falls within the.
Well, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to use inferential statistics to use our sample. So we have a sample here. And we're going to use that to answer the question of, hey, do we have enough evidence to say that Subway is lying? So our null hypothesis and our alternate hypothesis is what we're going to start talking about, and we'll get back to this data. But this gives you a sense of we'll keep going back to this. Okay, does everyone have the slides printed out for the lesson we're up to? It sounds right. The one on hypothesis testing?
Mhm.
Cool. So what is a hypothesis test? What is it? Well, it's the type of analysis that you do to answer questions, right? It's an example of inferential statistics where you're trying to answer the question of, is there enough evidence to say there's a difference between what Subway claims and what it actually is? That's the HDMI. Or is there enough evidence to say that there's a difference between operator 1 or operator 2? So there's a lot of terminology that gets involved in this. The first terminology we encounter is alpha. So that's your level of significance. So your level of significance is defined as 1 minus your confidence level. So generally you're operating at a 95% confidence level. So on the exam or in real life, unless there's a really good compelling reason why not to be at the 95% confidence level, you'll be at 95%. So if you're at a 95% confidence level, what does that mean alpha is? Okay, so alpha is 1 minus your confidence level. So if your confidence level is 95%,
0.5.
yeah, your alpha, your level of significance is 5%. 100 minus 95 is 5. So we'll keep going back to that. So then we have the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis is the state that you assume to be true. So you assume that Subway is telling the truth when they say that a sandwich is 12 inches long. Or you assume that the parts coming in from supplier 1 are the same as supplier 2. Or you assume that the variation before the continuous improvement effort is the same as the variation after the continuous improvement effort. Or in the case of chi-squared, you assume that your data follows the normal distribution. So that's your null hypothesis.
Yes.
So here's the procedure in a hypothesis test. You determine the statistic you're going to test. And remember that we can do hypothesis tests on all of our descriptive statistics. So we can do them on the mean, we can do them on the median, we can do them on the variance. Then you're going to formulate your null and alternate hypothesis. The null hypothesis is what you assume to be true. The alternate is what you're trying to prove. So in this case, of the Subway sandwiches, our null hypothesis is that the mean of the sandwiches is 12 inches. So the null is mu equals 12, right? That's what we assume to be true. So what are we trying to prove? What's our alternate hypothesis? That's the thing we want to prove.
That it's less than 12.
Yeah, that our sandwich is less than 12 inches, right? So our alternate hypothesis is that the sandwiches are less than 12 inches, right? Does anyone care if they got more than 12 inches of sandwich? They paid for 12 and they got 12 and a quarter? One of you did, right? We got 12 and a quarter? So do you care that you got an extra quarter inch? You got 11 and an 8. Do you care that you got short of 7/8 of an inch? A little bit, right? Maybe. You should. Okay. So we only care. So we only care if we're less than 12 inches. So our alternate hypothesis in the Subway example is that the Subway foot-long sandwiches are less than 12 inches. So mu is less than 12. So you establish your level of significance. Your level of significance, unless otherwise stated, is 5%, because you're generally going to be operating at the 95% confidence level. So you're going to determine the appropriate test, and there's a nice little flow chart on the next slide that deals with that. You're going to determine the critical values from the table, or if you bought the handy dandy TI-36X Pro, you can use the function built into that. But for your exam, not really important. If you're taking a black belt exam, we would spend more time on that. And then you're going to calculate the test statistic, and you're going to state the conclusion. And there's a big point up there, it's big in green because it's important, is that hypothesis tests don't prove anything, right? It's just math. The math can't answer the question of if there's a true significant difference between what you observe and what there really is. It's just doing mathematical operations to data. What you need to do to determine if there actually is a cause and effect relationship, what that Subway is you need to focus real efforts on discovering that. And when it comes to causation, we'll spend a bit of time in our design of experiment section when we'll talk about how do you design an experiment to determine if there's a causal relationship between factors. So does the fact that you got it at the Subway on West Park, does that predict that you're going to get a shorter sandwich? Where if you got it from another Subway, would you have gotten a longer? Stuff like that.
Probably because Monkey owned it.
So
Don't tell him.
as it relates to this relationship, what we're trying to do is find evidence that there is a difference. So the fact that we didn't find enough evidence to say that there's a difference doesn't mean it's not there. It just means that we didn't find it. We've all had the experience of looking for our keys and thought that we looked there, and then came back 5 minutes later and then like, didn't I already look there? And they find their keys. So the fact that we didn't find it just means we didn't find it. It doesn't mean it's not there. And that's one of the tensions that we deal with in hypothesis tests. So there's different types of things we can test for. So we can do hypothesis tests on the mean. And we'll see that there's an entire decision tree on the next slide for that. We can do hypothesis tests on the proportion. So is the defect rate from supplier 1 different than supplier 2? Well, my supplier says that the defect rate is 5%. How do I know why? So I can do a test on goodness of fit. So you use the goodness of fit to determine questions like, hey, Does my data follow a normal distribution? Does my data follow a Weibull distribution? All those distributions we talked about, we use the chi-square test to determine how well does our data follow our model. And then there's the variance. So a lot of the goals of continuous improvement projects are to reduce the variance or the standard deviation, because variation is a source of waste. So now we have our mean decision tree. So the first question we're asked is, are we dealing with one sample, two sample, or two or more samples? So in the case of our subway example, are we dealing with one sample, two sample, or two or more samples?
2 or more.
Raise your hand if you think it's two or more. Raise your hand if you think it's something else. Anyone think it's something else? Do we have a consensus? Okay. Well, it turns out we actually have one sample. So the idea here is sample is, what are we comparing? We're comparing your observed data to a specification. In the case of two samples, we're going to get Subway sandwiches from West Park, and we're going to get them from another location and say, is there a difference between my two samples? So if we wanted to do two or more samples, we would get it from the Subway in Eatontown, the Subway in New Brunswick, and the Subway in Camden, and say, hey, is there a statistically significant difference between these three Subway locations? But in the case where you're comparing one data set, one sample, to a specification, you're dealing with a one sample case. So we would be on the left-hand side. And then we have the question of how big is our sample size? If our sample size is greater than 30 or so, we go with the z-test. If our sample size is less than 30, we go with the t-test. And we'll talk a bit about this a little bit probably tomorrow, next class, but for the coming attraction. The t-test was actually developed by a guy named Gossett, who was working for Guinness. Anyone familiar with Guinness?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So what goes into beer?
Yeast,
Okay.
hops.
Yep.
Barley.
Yep, hops and barley. And where is Guinness made?
Ireland.
Yeah. Do you know where the barley comes from?
It's far afield, right?
Comes from all over the place, right?
Yeah.
A lot of it comes from the U.S. Actually, strangely enough. It's a world market. So what Gossett was trying to do is figure out, hey, it's really expensive for me to get all of this barley strictly from the U.S., get it over here, make sure it's good. So I can get these little samples relatively easily, but I can't get bushels of it sent over. So what Gossett was working on was, how do I use a relatively small sample size and be able to draw conclusions about the barley to predict how good the beer is going to be? So the next time you're at a bar, drinking some Guinness, think about the student t-test. And it's referred to as the student test because Guinness was so paranoid that the other beer makers would realize that Gossett was one of their guys. So when he published this, they would know their secret. So it was published under the name of Student. It's a pseudonym. And there's another guy, R.A. Fisher, who didn't particularly like Gossett, who said it was so simple a student can do it. And there's many letters going back and forth between the two. R.A. Fisher is quite the character. Brilliant, but quite the character. So that's the t-test. So if we're dealing with two samples, we have a similar question. Well, we don't have a similar question. We have a different question. We have the first is there a relationship between my first sample and my second sample? So what do I mean by relationship? Well, if I take a sample from the Eatontown subway and I take one from the New Brunswick subway, is there any relationship between the sandwiches? No, right? But in the case of you measuring your sandwich and your colleague measuring your sandwich, is there a relationship? Yeah, right, it's the same sandwich. So,
But then it's not two samples.
but it is because we have two different measurements. And we want to compare, is there a statistically significant difference between your measurements and your partner's
Then
measurements?
why did we say this was one sample? This is two sample then.
It depends what we're comparing. If we're answering the question of, is there enough evidence to say that Subway is lying? It's one sample. If we're evaluating as part of our gauge R and R, if there's a statistically significant difference between operators, we're then in a two-sample case because we have you measure it and your colleague measure it. So the type of question we would be answering as it relates to gauge R&R when we're comparing you to your neighbor is what term? What term relates to the variation that's due to different people with the same part and the same measurement device? What's the word for that?
So again,
Okay. When we talked about gauge R&R, we talked about the purpose of a gauge R&R is to partition the variation into three buckets. The variation due to the parts, so that's how the sandwich is changed from sandwich to sandwich.
Mhm.
The variation that's due to the measurement system, that's if you were to measure the same operator multiple times with the same tape measure. And then the source of the variation that's due to your people.
so it's the people.
It's the people. And what's the word that means the variation due to the people? Reproducibility, right? Reproducibility is the source of the variation that's associated with different people. So in this case, by having you and your colleague measure it, we're trying to approximate the effect of the reproducibility. What percent of the variation is attributable to that? So to answer the question of, is there a statistically significant difference between you and your neighbor, you would use the paired t-test because you measured the same thing. And we want to prove or disprove, we want to prove there is a difference. So our null hypothesis is that your measurement is the same as your neighbor's measurement. Your alternate is they're different, right? So that's an example of a paired t-test. Another example that's common of paired t-tests are weight loss. So you weigh in with Weight Watchers, you go through a treatment, and you weigh in a couple weeks later, and you see how your weight changed. So this relationship between your first sample, when you first weighed in, and when you're weighing in 6 weeks later, you're still the same person. You didn't change. So you want to see how those individual values change. Not really concerned about how the average of the group changed. So if there's a relationship between your first sample and your second sample, you're measuring the same sandwich, you're measuring the same EU, you're going to use the paired t-test. Otherwise, if you don't have that relationship, if the first sample has no relationship, they're completely disconnected from each other, you're going to use one of the other types of the t-test, either the t-test for equal variance or the t-test for unequal variance. And if we're dealing with the case of two or more, so we have two samples or more, we're going to deal with ANOVA, which stands for analysis of variance. So ANOVA is a really powerful tool because it allows me to compare as many samples as I want. I could take every subway in New Jersey and use ANOVA to say, is there a statistically significant difference between the average length of a sandwich in all of these 500 or so locations? You can do that with ANOVA. The one downside to ANOVA is you lose out the directionality. Remembering how it was important to us that the subway foot long be less than 12 inches, ANOVA can't answer that question. ANOVA can only say, is there a difference between these guys? Is there a statistically significant difference due to locations 1 through 500 in New Jersey? And say if it's greater than or less than, it can just answer the question, is it different? Whereas the other hypothesis test we can test for 3 different cases. We can test for the case of greater than, less than, or not equal to. ANOVA, only not equal to. So the null and alternate hypothesis, we'll kind of step through this. So the null hypothesis is the condition that you assume to be true. The alternate hypothesis is what you're trying to prove. So you're trying to prove, if you're the attorney representing these two guys from Old Bridge, that the sandwiches are less than 12 inches. So we have alpha. So it's the risk of rejecting the null hypothesis when it's actually true. This is called type 1 error. So how do we choose what our level of significance is? Well, it's generally 95%. So alpha equals 5%, or no 5. But different circumstances, you might want to change what it is. So then you have beta risk. So beta risk is the risk of accepting the null hypothesis when it's actually false. So then we have the p-value, is the probability of getting a value as extreme or more extreme than the test statistic. if the null hypothesis was true. So it's the probability of getting your data if what you assume to be true is in fact true.
Amphibious 4139. Amphibious 4139.
So this is a good way to think about it. And I think this is sort of an important way. And of course, it loops into the law, so it gets both my worlds together. Weird schizophrenic that way. Okay, so in the criminal justice system, what is your null hypothesis? How many of you like watch like Law and Order and other movies? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Hopefully you haven't encountered the criminal justice system as a person, but okay. Everyone in the U.S. is innocent. Exactly. So what's the null hypothesis? The defendant is innocent. What's the alternate?
They're guilty.
Yeah, they're guilty. If you want to prove that they're guilty, you're assuming they're innocent, so your null hypothesis is the defendant is innocent. The alternate is he's guilty. Okay, so what is our level of significance in the criminal justice system? That's a really cool phrase that comes up a lot on closing arguments. Anyone know what the phrase is? Beyond a reasonable doubt?
Right.
Okay, so beyond a reasonable doubt, there's lots of law literature about what percentage that is. But of course, it's really high threshold, right? Why is that? Because we want to make sure that we don't put an innocent person in jail. We want to make sure that the state can prove their case, that we're going to be so intolerant of putting someone that's innocent in jail that we're going to make this bar really high for the state to prove. So what's our alpha level like? What's our... Well, just it's not a number. It's not a number, but do we have are we really tolerant at type 1 risk in the criminal justice system? So what does that represent in the criminal justice system? Let me phrase it that way. So for there to be type 1 error, the guy would be, for the type 1 error to occur, what has to have happened, right? We have two cases. We have,
He'd be guilty when we said he was innocent.
well, let's see. Our null hypothesis is that the guy's innocent, right? And then there's two cases, right? He actually did it or he didn't do it. So our type 1 error relates to the case where the guy actually didn't do it, he's innocent, and the jury says he's guilty. So that's our alpha risk. So in the criminal justice system, what's alpha like? Really small, right? Because we want to make sure that that risk almost never happens. We don't want to put an innocent person in jail. Everyone cool with that? So alpha risk is the risk of putting a innocent defendant in jail. And we want that value to be really, really, really small. Okay, then we have our beta risk. So we have the O.J. Simpson case, right? Where he actually did it, and the jury, for whatever reason, says, no. So that's beta risk. So that's the case where our null hypothesis is actually false, and we say it's true. So in that case, the jury, well, he wrote a book saying he did it, so he did it. So the defendant was guilty, but the jury said he was innocent. That's beta risk. Everyone cool with that? The exam will try to trip you up on the difference between alpha and beta risk. So alpha risk is the risk of putting an innocent guy in jail. Beta risk is the risk of a guilty guy getting set free. However, you can process that in your mind to be able to be familiar with that. So null hypothesis, we all agreed, is that you're innocent. So null, defendant is innocent. Alternate thing you're trying to prove, defendant is guilty.
So what is the type 1 again? Can you say that again?
Yep. Type 1 is the probability of rejecting the null hypothesis, so going with the alternate hypothesis, when it's in fact true. So the guy is innocent, and the jury says he's guilty. That's type 1 alpha risk. And in the criminal justice system, that value is set really small. We want to make it very unlikely that an innocent person goes to jail. We're more tolerant of the beta risk, where the state doesn't cover its burden and we let a guilty guy go golfing. As it relates to that, in the civil case, right? Everyone remembers that O.J. Simpson was found innocent in the criminal case, but was found liable in the civil case, right?
Right.
It turns out the risk of a type of error changes much, much higher. We're more tolerant to an alpha risk in civil cases. It goes to a preponderance of the evidence. Scales. Everyone cool with alpha versus beta? We'll come back to it a couple times. Okay, so how do we decide if we're doing a one-tail or a two-tail test? Well, it depends what our alternate hypothesis is. So in the case of our subway example, are we doing a one-tail test or a two-tail test? Well, you have the examples of what your alternates are up there, right? So what was our alternate hypothesis in the case of the subway sandwiches? What was the alternate hypothesis? What were we trying?
Less than 12.
Less than,
Okay.
less than 12.
So based upon this, what would you say? Is that a one-tail or a two-tail?
One tail.
It's not equal to 6 to 2.
See those guys? The ones that say H1 is less than,
Was your like,
right there,
oh,
Oh, okay.
right? The two-tail is the case of not equal. Yeah,
The alternative here is less than.
yeah, which is,
It is less than.
yeah. So the shaded region, the reject region, is set to our level of significance. So if we're at a 95% confidence level, what should the area of the blue region be? In all cases, 5%, right? In the case of the two-tail test, we have half and half. In the case of the one-tail test,
4042, John, 4042.
it's all on one side. Everyone cool with that? Sometimes the answers are pretty right on the slides to make it nice and easy. So the subway example is an example of a one-tail test. So how do we determine the appropriate test? Well, there's lots of different tests. So there's the z-test. So use the z-test when you have a relatively large sample size. What makes a relatively large sample size? Generally greater than 30. Why 30? Because they say so. It's basically where the z and t distributions converge, but it's sort of arbitrary. The t is the case where you have a relatively small sample size, relatively small being less than 30. The paired t you use in the case where there is a relationship between one sample and the next. So when you and your partner measured the subway sandwich. ANOVA is the case where you're comparing 2 or more samples. So if you want to compare New Brunswick, Eatontown, Camden, etc., you would use ANOVA. The F-test is used to compare the variance, the variation. So if we want to say, hey, does one store have more control over the expansion of their bread than another? And then there's the chi-square test to say, hey, we're assuming that the sandwiches follow a normal distribution. Do we have enough evidence to say that that's not a good assumption? And there's lots more tests. So how do we find the critical value of a test statistic? Well, you can use the standard normal table, which is in the back of the book. The student t distribution, which is in the back of the book. The F distribution, chi-square distribution, those are all tables in the back of the book. So how do we read these things? Well, the good news is, for the purposes of your exam, the values that are highlighted are the ones that you're going to need. So you're going to need to know the z alpha over 2 value of 1.96. You will also need to know the z alpha value in the case of a one-tailed test, which equals 1.645. I'm sorry. Yes. Did I put it in the next one? Sorry.
So if you go back a screen, what's the difference between the red and the green?
The green. The red is at the 5% level of significance. The green is at the
1%.
1%. So one would be, if you're at a 95% confidence level, the green is at the 99% confidence level. And the way you read this table is the closest column gives you the first value and the first decimal point, and the top gives you the second decimal point. This value represents 1.90, 1.91, 1.92, 1.93. Everyone see that? Good news is for this exam, you will only see 95%. So if you know the 1.96 value for Z alpha over 2 will be 7. That's in the case of a two-tailed test. And for a two-tailed test, what's the form of our alternate hypothesis? Is it greater than, less than, or not equal to for a two-tailed test? Not equal to. Not equal to is always a two-tailed test. Yes. So for a one-tailed test, so that's the case of less than or greater than. Less than or greater than. So if that's the case, at the 95% confidence level, your Z alpha value is going to be 1.645 or 1.644. Between 1.6, the decimal point. So if you use 1.64, you're fine. Okay. So now it gets a little bit more complicated to figure out what our critical value is for the t distribution. So for the t distribution, we need to know our alpha value, and we need to know our degrees of freedom. And their degrees of freedom are our sample size minus 1. So n minus 1. So how many degrees of freedom did we have for our Subway sandwiches?
7.
7. Okay, so based upon that, at the 95% confidence level, alpha equals 5%, what's our critical value? Okay, so we read down the first column for degrees of freedom, and we want to find 7, right? Which happens to be right there.
1.894.
And then we read over at 5%, okay? 1.895. Everyone comfortable doing that? Okay. So for the F table, it's a little bit more complicated. We need to know the degrees of freedom of our numerator.
What table was this one? A P table?
T. T distribution.
Oh, I see it.
Yep, up at the top. It's also in the back of your book. And then we have the F table. So the F table is used for the F test, and it's also used in ANOVA. For that, we need to know the degrees of freedom of the numerator, which is going to be our one sample size, minus 1. And we need to know the degrees of freedom for our denominator. Okay. We are just gonna. Okay, so why don't we call it a day here, and we'll have to start walking through the test. Everyone, woke up. Sorry about being like a couple minutes late. Just trying to do as well. Can you eat the sandwiches?
Snack time for them.
It's kind of strange. Generally, when I teach this, everyone like dives into the sandwiches immediately. It's like, you guys I see all. Did anyone actually eat your sandwich?
I did. I ate half.
Okay.
Maybe a quarter.
Okay. Yeah. Any questions for me before we break?
You're going to resend that email that I apparently didn't get?
Yeah, I'll resend that email.
I probably got it and deleted it by accident,
That's
but if
fine.
you could resend.
No problem.
Thank you.
Any other questions for me? Remember the Subway sandwiches. We'll keep coming back to them. You'll hate them by the end of this. Thank you guys, and I'll see you next week.